So, very good morning. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Prime Talk. To some of you I don't see, so I stand up. Welcome to the Prime Talk, dealing with the rule of law and mutual trust in the European Union. What's in the EU arsenal? It is my big pleasure to be here with you to moderate this session this morning. I'm Sergio Carrera. I'm Senior Research Fellow at CEPS, and I've been working at CEPS for quite some time, following very closely these topics. We are so grateful to have such a panel today to celebrate our 40th anniversary of CEPS, and also all the work we've done in this topic with such distinguished colleagues and people that we've been following, whose work we've been following very closely as well. Now, we are waiting for Vice President Jourova. She will join us in any minute. But I just wanted to start introducing the panel. Hopefully she will arrive. Otherwise, we will proceed and adapt, as life it is. So, perfect. I'm informed she's in the house, so eventually she will arrive in the room. So, across the days, yesterday and today, we've examined a number of topics falling within the Justice and Home Affairs portfolio, and we've really understood. Please, Commissioner Jourova, please, welcome. Please, you have your seat there ready, please. So we've understood how central EU principles, EU values enshrined in Article 2 of the treaties are for all those policies, for upholding mutual trust, and many also times mutual recognition, the principle of mutual recognition. Now, we've also learned how contested these areas are, how politicized and how vulnerable to developments all these fields are. And we've seen that in so many occasions. The refugee crisis in 2015, COVID pandemic also impacting terrorism, you name it. A number of highly relevant events making extremely complicated precisely that, to uphold those values and those principles. Now, the premise according to which all EU countries comply with these principles is also more and more unrealistic. We know now that there are some member states in the EU who are actively undermining EU principles as a policy choice, clearly actively running against EU values, values that makes us also what we are as Europeans. And we also have this issue in many countries around Europe. It's not, a couple of folks. Many governments, even if they declare themselves as liberal democracies, they also run and actually, engage in a number of policies which raise rule of law and fundamental rights and democratic questions. Just for reference, at CEPS, we published recently a paper analyzing the role of how certain governments in the EU are policing NGOs and civil society in their work with migrants and asylum seekers. Now, after this introduction, again, I have such a distinguished panel, and we are very grateful to have you all here. We will start with Commissioner Jourova. We really thank you for joining us. You have such an outstanding and an important role in the European Commission at times of really upholding the rule of law, and this Commission has also engaged very actively in a number of new initiatives, how to monitor the rule of law. We discussed yesterday the question as to how to enforce effectively EU values around EU member states, all EU member states. So we very much look forward to hearing your speech and your ideas and your thoughts on what can the EU do more or less in this area in light of what we have now. So Commissioner, you have the floor, please.
It was quick, what is it? Good morning. And sorry for coming late. We had a college and we discussed how to decrease the number of transport accidents. So I was in a little bit another topic. But indeed, this is my topic, the rule of law and related things like fundamental rights and democracy, democratic elections. All that is in one basket. And if we all are on board in the EU, I mean the 27 member states, there will be trust. And you spoke about the trust. And because it is not the case, of course, we see that the erosion started with these hesitations, whether we are all on board. And I can tell you, whenever we work on the new legislation, like an example, the Media Freedom Act, we have to count with the fact that in some states, yeah, hi Cecilia, that is Cecilia, my former colleague, that in some member states the law will not help but will be abused. When we want the member states to establish independent media bodies, independent media boards, the question is, can the autocrat give the blessing to creation of independent body to check the space for media, not the media, but the space for media? I have doubts. So whatever we do now, we have to count with this new situation. We enriched our toolbox to protect and strengthen the rule of law principle. We have two new things. It's the rule of law report and it's the conditionality principle. I don't know if we will have time for some dialogue, so of course I'm ready to answer questions. On the rule of law report, at some moment, sometimes already in 2017, I was Justice Commissioner those days. We realized that we need to do the comprehensive mapping to be able to compare the situation in different member states. And so we established this rule of law report as a preventive tool, so that to detect early on the negative tendencies in some countries in 4 chapters or four sectors or four items: judiciary, anti-corruption, media, and checks and balances. And we came with a very strong methodology and very transparent process of collecting data from the member states. We stabilized the channels of information, and now we are already working on the 4th edition of this rule of law report, the second one containing recommendations to the member states. And you might say, where is the result? Where are the teeth of it? And no, I will not say that it is not about the teeth. It is, because we can start a dialogue with the member states at the early stage. I am traveling to the parliaments to discuss the findings, and also it's a good thing for the member states themselves that they can compare the systems. We have 27 unique constitutional systems and different setup of the checks and balances. The rule of law already brought some fruits. It opened very broad discussion with the key people and institutions in Slovakia. We are pushing Spain to introduce changes into the way they select and appoint the judges. I had a very good discussion with the Greek representatives, and all that is based on very good data and very good analysis. This is our strength, that we know that we have very good knowledge of each member state system. I'm sometimes asked whether the recommendations might be the first step for infringements. Might be, but it's not the purpose of it. Yeah? But I can see the development that some of the recommendations was once not followed by or addressed by the member states might lead to infringements. Last year we had the first round of recommendations, and we will repeat them this year again in the situation when the state did not react on it. Conditionality. I think it was in 2017 again. It was a strong year for me. In 2017, I said in Vienna at a conference that maybe if somebody doesn't understand the values, he might understand the money. And I proposed to connect the EU money with the values. It was a huge scandal. How come? This is incredibly cheeky, and then you saw that it was developed further. Now we have 3 moments, or 3, how to say, yeah, I would say moments when we can say to the member state, we will not fund unless you do something. One is conditionality, now applied on Hungary. It costs them 7.5 billion of frozen cohesion money. We froze the operational programs where there is majority of money financed through the public procurement, where Hungary has a problem. Then the recovery plan, there is both Poland and Hungary affected. For Poland, it's 35 billion euro now being stopped. Not forever, but they have to adopt the law which we requested last year in June. And also back to the also for Hungary, there is now the stop for cohesion money because of the financial regulation, which says that the member state has to have in order the values-related things, especially the fundamental rights framework. So for Hungary, this is additional 5.5 billion euro. The third line, so 3 lines: conditionality, the recovery plans being conditioned, and the third is this financial regulation with this criterion of fundamental rights. It is helping. The money aspect seems to be powerful than the speeches and declarations. And even it seems to be more powerful than Article 7, which was meant to correct the situation in a member state with the warning that if you do not behave, you might be deprived of the voting rights. The little thing there is that you need 26 member states on board. Again, Article 7, useful, but there was a lack of imagination on the side of the legislators when they were designing that, because simply the solidarity between the states is maybe stronger than the values, which we should share. Very shortly, we are working on strengthening the situation of the media. Here I am going from rule of law, pure rule of law, to more democratic protection of democracy. We are strengthening fight against disinformation through the code of practice. This code of practice is not easy to explain what it is. It's a complementary item or piece of rules to the Digital Services Act. And the main beauty of the code for me is that nobody has the stamp, the rubber stamp, to say what is the truth and what is the lie. It's not for me, it's not for any minister, it's not for Mr. Zuckerberg, not even for Mr. Musk, to say this is lie, this is truth. We try to encourage very broad societal response. So the platforms are obliged to hire the journalists and the people, the organizations who are able to work with the facts, to label the disinformation. And of course, in the most harsh cases, when the disinformation is threatening the public security, which is now the Russian propaganda, no mercy, it has to be removed. But it is also connected with the sanctions regime. We are working on the anti-corruption package, so to harmonize the criminal offenses and the penalties, also for the EU institutions, which is highly topical, unfortunately now. I am working on the ethics body and also on the defense of democracy package, which should make the financial flows coming to EU from the third countries more transparent, so that we know who is paid from where and for what purpose. Sorry, I took it very, very quickly at the end, but you didn't show me any nervousness. But still, I know that I only had 7 minutes.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. Now, Commissioner, you mentioned a number of very interesting points on what you also deem to be more effective when speaking with certain governments, but you also highlight that this is an issue, cross-cutting issue, for many EU member states in different elements. and how the Commission is actually building this knowledge, the knowledge base necessary to, to enter into this conversation and to substantiate action. And speaking of knowledge, the Fundamental Rights Agency, as an agency really dedicated to fundamental rights, produces enormous, really substantive information and analysis on the situation of fundamental rights across the European Union. And we are really delighted to have Michael O'Flaherty, the director of the FRA, with us, and to hear from him also the work, how the FRA is contributing in this area of monitoring and upholding the rule of law. Please, Michael.
Sergio, thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here. And indeed, echoing what Vice President Jourova said, every day I'm confronted by some manifestation of erosion or challenging of the rule of law. Yesterday I was in the PEGA committee of the Parliament looking at the use of spyware, including by states, in a highly illegal manner. That's a challenge to rule of law. I spend a lot of my time on the borders, the external borders. Just 2 weeks ago, I was on one such troubled border where we see not just pushbacks, well documented, but also acts of criminality where you can literally get away with it. And we have the repeated, persistent ignoring of court judgments, including those of the European Courts of Justice and Human Rights. Last week, I sat with transgender and intersex activists who told me stories of being harassed by police and being blocked by the state in some places from gaining access to the medicines they need. So rule of law under threat everywhere and arguably getting worse. In that context, I want to just spend a word welcoming the achievements. I want to express appreciation to Vice President Jourova and all those who have erected what I think in the 7 years since I started to engage with the EU is an impressive architecture which can of course be strengthened. Conditionality will be a game changer, of that I'm sure. The Commission's rule of law mechanism is worth acknowledging. Let's not overlook the European Parliament Libe's Committee Monitoring Group on Democracy, Rule of Law and Fundamental Rights. There's the very, very remarkably evolved rule of law dialogue in the Council, and there's, of course, the persistent guidance, albeit sometimes ignored, from the Court of Justice and from the Court of Human Rights. But I think in the continuous struggle to strengthen the machinery, 2023 is a remarkably significant year. This is the year of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UDHR is the nearest thing we have to a universally shared articulation of the values in a rule of law state. And so it's exactly the year for that extra push. What would the extra push look like? Well, I'd like to start not at the EU, but at the national level. We have a lot of arguments, which I don't want to get into, about competency, what should the EU do versus the state. I'm just going to park all of that because the primary place in any case is the nation. That's where rule of law needs to be respected. And in that context, I'd like to flag 5 issues. The first is civil society. Sergio, you mentioned it earlier. We're constantly mapping the situation of civil society across the EU. And we see, just in summary, the issues inside the EU are no different to those chronicled by the UN worldwide. We have serious issues in many places. Let's not keep zeroing in on 1 or 2 countries. We have issues in many places. Secondly, echoing indeed what the Commissioner just said, we have to keep investing in a free and diverse media. It's absolutely critical to the rule of law state. Third, and maybe an issue that doesn't get listed in these categories quite so often, but we have to also, in all our appropriate ways, continue to invest in top quality legal education. We have the lawyers and the judges and the courts that are the products of the education that they receive in a large part. And so legal education needs to become a focus of attention, not just, but across the member states and indeed in the context of the EU. Another dimension, the fourth of my 5 at the national level, is the need to have in place strong, well-resourced national human rights institutions. And that's not just my agency or O'Flaherty running a favorite issue. But if you go to the Sustainable Development Goals, there's a marvelous Smurf version of them outside. Many of you walk past it to get in here. But the Sustainable Development Goals, Article 16 is the SDG addressing rule of law. And one of the indicators that's been universally agreed for the delivery of SDG 16 is the establishment of a national human rights institution. And disappointingly, there are still 3 EU member states without such an institution, which is really astonishing, to be honest, in 2023. I'm talking about Czechia, Malta, and Italy. Efforts continue to be made in all 3 countries, but disappointingly, we're not yet there. And the final of the 5 national level focuses of attention I'd like to speak to briefly is an initiative from the Commission, supported by us, which hasn't understandably yet received much attention, and that's the National Rule of Law Dialogues. Dialogues at the country level around the products of the Commission reporting and the other EU-generated materials. Commissioner Renders took the initiative on this. We're piloting it in 5 countries, but the ambition is that very soon, in a couple of years' time, these dialogues will take place every year, organised indigenously, if you will, within the member state, with a view to triggering the necessary discussions around these hot issues. And by the way, getting them out of the abstract categorisation of rule of law, which we know from our work resonates almost nowhere on the street. We have to unpack it in order to gain the interest. But let me come back briefly to the EU level now, and I left it deliberately, as I said, to second. And of course, and nobody I think would dispute this, all the mechanisms can continue to be strengthened. But let me take one example of a mechanism that does need strengthening, and that's the Council's peer-to-peer review. If you compare the Council's peer-to-peer review with, let's say, the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, you see that it has a long way to go. In the Council here in Brussels, it takes place, a country gets reviewed over perhaps 30 minutes without the presence of civil society, with very little documentation going into the public domain, and the whole thing a very hidden world. Now maybe it has to be to build up confidence, I'm not in a position to say so, but nevertheless, the UPR in Geneva is indicative of where we can go to make this a much more effective and valuable tool in the standing up for rule of law. And the second point I'd make about the EU level institutions, developments rather, is that it's all very confusing. And it's all very divisible into multiple contexts which don't necessarily speak to each other. And for anybody following the story in the EU, there's a lot there that's operating quite distinct one from the other. And here I'd like to recall the long-standing call from the European Parliament for an interinstitutional agreement. And I think it would be of high value if the co-legislators would look at joining the dots so that we see some integrated element or strategy behind the multiple diverse initiatives that we currently find across the institutions. And beyond joining up what we already have, again, 2023 is a good year to ask, what more do we need? And I'd like to come back in this regard in particular to SDG 16. An indicator of a rule of law state is a strong national human rights institution. And so I would welcome a resuscitation of the debate about having an equivalent of a national human rights institution for the European Union. Now, some of you will think that's O'Flaherty just pushing for a bigger mandate for his agency. That's not what I'm doing. That's not what I'm doing. Maybe that's the way it would happen. Maybe the FRA would get an expanded mandate, an own initiative mandate for monitoring, for investigation, for commenting on draft legislation. But that doesn't have to be the outcome. All I'm suggesting today is that it's time to resuscitate the discussion about what an NHRI for Europe would look like and how we could put it in place.
Michael,
Let me wrap
please?
up.
Yes.
Isn't it good I said that? Let me wrap up with just 2 observations. One is, let's make sure our rule of law discussion keeps track with the evolving nature of our societies. The 2 elements I have in mind here are firstly the by now long-standing but still ubiquitous privatization of public services. What does that mean in terms of rule of law? And second, there's the digitalization of public services. And how do we keep up with that in terms of standing up for rule of law? Keep in mind the scandal not far from here with social welfare payments just a few years, automated social welfare payments just a few years ago. And the very last point, Sergio, rule of law is not just within our nations, it's not just within our EU, but it's for all of us in the context of international crimes. We are witnessing international crimes perpetrated very close to here in the Russian aggression in Ukraine, and they trigger a responsibility for all of us because an international crime is a crime against all of our societies, and so it is a rule of law issue for us to do justice for the victims of the crimes in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. Also, a set of very concrete proposals, some of which also correspond with other voices. At SEPS, for instance, we've been calling for many other things as well that you've mentioned, having the UPR as a model, calling for the interinstitutional agreement between all the relevant EU institutions to work together on this, and joining the dots. Very important, because indeed very complex to know, to understand all these fragmented instruments and venues. So joining the dots is absolutely crucial as well. So thank you so much, Michael. Now next, someone that I also really admire, the work that Emily O'Reilly, as a European Ombudsman, has done for many years. And Commissioner Jourova mentioned before also how important the rule of law is also for European institutions themselves, in terms of legitimacy of European institutions and the work that EU institutions are doing in monitoring rule of law of governments. And we are delighted to have the Ombudsperson with us. Emily, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the invitation. I am going slightly off piece in that the two speakers, Vice President Jourova and Michael here, have been speaking about the rule of law as it applies externally to member states and so on, and I'm going to talk about the rule of law as it applies to the administration itself. If we can't keep our own house in order, we're in no position to lecture others, and I think many of you will have noticed the words of Viktor Orban. As soon as the Qatargate happened, he was quick to wag the finger and say, "How can you lecture me when you have these problems?" That was entirely predictable. It also shows how important it is to prevent those sort of things from happening, or at least to put in place mechanisms that will make sure they won't happen in future. So, I mean, I think I regard the EU as a really precious global resource. I really do, and I think the power that the EU has to influence things for the better globally cannot be overestimated. I think we see that there's such a clamour, obviously sparked by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for so many countries to join and for us to speed up their initiation into the EU. And I don't think it's just for the money and those benefits. I think they also want the protection of the rule of law and the values that sustain good lives, basically, good lives for themselves, good lives for their countries, and good lives for their families. And we also see, I mean, I'm Irish, so you'd probably expect me to say this, but we've looked at how the UK Prime Minister is now extolling the virtues of the EU over the last few days, when he's trying to persuade the people in Northern Ireland to accept changes to the protocol. And he was saying Northern Ireland must be the luckiest country in the world, access to the UK and to the EU single market. So some people have been saying, well, that's exactly what we had 7 years ago. But anyway, yeah, anyway, this is not Schadenfreude. Well, it is really, but anyway. So I guess what my office does, if I say it in a kind of a non-legal way, we try and keep the good guys good, because I do believe that the EU administration is fundamentally good. Its standards are higher than many of those in the member state, many of those globally, but they have to be because of the role that the EU administration has, both over the member states and all of our lives, but also the global influencer that it can be. So, when we're talking about the rule of law and breaches of the rule of law in member states and corruption, which is really a manifestation of the breakdown of the rule of law, we have to obviously make sure that the EU administration seeks to prevent corruption within its own ranks. Now, corruption is a very strong word, and I mean it has been liberally used in relation to Qatargate, and as I've said on a few occasions, it was very easy to understand that. It was immediately graphically visible to us. I mean, literal suitcases full of banknotes. I mean, if somebody was drawing a cartoon of corruption, that is precisely what they would be drawing. So we can all understand that. But that story went global. That story went global, and that's what I talk about, guarding the reputation of the EU in relation to its adherence to its own rules and values is so important. That's why I'm hoping that the conversation that I know Vice President Jourova and President Metsola of the Parliament are having, and what they're trying to push through, and I absolutely trust their bona fides in relation to this, but, there are people who are pushing back, and the extent to which they can, pushback. The pushback is really important. But there are other forms of, again, what I would call soft corruption, which don't grab the headlines in the same way, and thankfully don't go global as Qatargate did. So, and we get many complaints in relation to this, and I'm talking about revolving doors cases when, when officials from the European Commission, the European administration, go to the private sector, and where their insider knowledge and network is essentially monetized by them and exploited by the people they're going to work for. I mean, it is as simple as that. Not in every case, but there can be some egregious cases in which it is clear that that is what is happening. We've done many investigations into this. I know there's always a balance between the right to work and the protection of the public interest. But, from what we have found, there tends to be a reluctance to prevent people from taking on positions, even though it is clear when you read the websites of the consultancies to which many of them go, it is clear what they are there for. They are there to provide inside information to the clients of the consultancies. It's as simple as that. And that, at times, can be a form of soft corruption because it's basically the purchase of influence. Lobbying, an entirely legitimate profession, because the Commission and others have to know the impact of the laws that they're proposing, are working on, the impact that they're going to have in the real world, shall we say, and therefore lobbying is entirely legitimate, but it has to be transparent. And I think there's also an onus on the administration to be absolutely aware of the various forms that lobbying can take. Some of you may have seen the Uber files, the leaks from the Uber company when it was trying to influence legislation in relation to that form of transport in Europe over the last few years. And I remember remarking at the time that every official in the administration should read the Uber files. It's a masterclass in lobbying. So I think there has to be an awareness of how this happens. Another piece of work that we've done is legislative transparency in the Council, which can sound very dry and boring, but it actually goes to the heart of the matter because, fundamental to the rule of law and to the democracy of the EU, to the legitimacy of the EU, is that citizens have a treaty right to take part in the democratic life of the Union, and that includes having their say on legislation that has been discussed in Council, Parliament, Commission. But if they don't know what's going on, it's impossible for them to have that impact. Now, I understand how difficult it must be to get 27 member states to agree on anything. And I know they feel that, look, if they're constantly bombarded by people trying to get involved in the debate, it makes it even more difficult. But they have to make sure that that balance is correct, because it is not right that citizens who know pretty well what goes on in their member states, what their governments are proposing, what the various arguments are, who's trying to influence it and why, and the outcomes, are not afforded that same right very often in the EU itself. So again, we've done a lot of work in that. And at the beginning, we were asking for very simple things when it came to a particular form of negotiation called trilogues, which is the informal talks between Commission, Parliament and Council. And the things we were asking for at the beginning was, could you put a list of the trilogues that are taking place? Could you say what they're about? Could you say where they're taking place and so on? Very, very simple, basic things. We were not looking for the whole thing to be made completely transparent in the moment, because we recognise that it is in the public interest for there to be a space for deliberation. But that as well should be limited. It can't go on for years. We also have focused on fundamental rights, the rule of law. As a result of inquiries that I did and my predecessor did, Frontex now has a complaints mechanism for people who feel that their fundamental rights have been breached. You can argue the extent to which it is even known about or worked, but at least it's there. There's more monitoring to make sure that EU funds are spent in line with the EU Charter. And we know the EU financial regulation is to be updated so that the conflict of interest issue is dealt with appropriately. And that arose from a case that we had when the Commission had given a contract, a small contract, not very valuable in terms of, value in terms of its monetary value, to BlackRock, which most of you know is the biggest probably global investment company in the entire world. And it was given a tender to advise on rules in relation to banking regulation when it came to sustainability. And we didn't find maladministration because the conflict of interest rules were so narrow that we didn't feel it was fair to kick the officials in the head because they had followed them. But what we did say was that there was clearly a conflict of interest there between BlackRock, in which a lot of its investors are into fossil fuels and so on, and then it making or advising on regulations for that. So as a result of that, that particular issue is being dealt with. Just on the on the Qatargate scandal, Vice President Jourova said that it was amazing, how things changed in relation to adherence to the rule of law when money came into it. When it wasn't just lectures and so on, but rather when there was an actual penalty to be paid. And equally, I think that Qatargate has probably accelerated the slow moves towards improving the rules in relation to ethics in the various institutions and so on. There is nothing like a scandal to make everybody, pay attention and do things, but we still await what those things are. I think a very illustrative graphic on this, I think one newspaper, I think it was Le Soir, they looked at in 2022 the declarations that MEPs had made in relation to trips abroad that had been paid for by others. I think broadly speaking that was it. So they did a chart. So January to November, virtually a flat line, hardly any declarations. December, Qatargate happens, suddenly the line jumps. Why? Because oh sweet God, I better put my declarations in now. And they did put the declarations in, which is fine, but it just showed that the fact that they didn't feel that they had to between January and November, or January, December, shows that there is a problem there. So just last point, I recently had an informal meeting with the European Court of Auditors, the European Anti-Fraud Office, the European Public Prosecutor's Office, who are all basically involved in these integrity issues, to see how we could contribute to this particular debate. And I mean, it would help if our recommendations were accepted a little more sort of comprehensively than they are. I know OLAF, the anti-fraud agency, is an issue with has a long-standing disagreement with the Parliament in relation to its powers to go into MEPs' offices and so on. We will be having a public event. This is an ad with those agencies, with the institutions, and with civil society and media and others. And perhaps some of you will be able to attend either virtually or in real life. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for really your impressive contribution to, boost transparency and integrity in European administration. So now we have two discussants. In fact, this session falls within an EU-funded project, which is called STREAM, that CEPS is coordinating, which deals with a European arrest warrant, but through the lens of the rule of law. Mutual recognition in criminal justice, and we take a broader rule of law angle to it. And we have two colleagues who've worked with CEPS actually for a very long time and who are partners in the project and contributors intensely, and I'm really glad also that they are here today in our celebration of our anniversary. Starting with Ilse Tralmacka, Fair Trials International. I will say, to my mind, came the best NGO in the area, really. Amazing work, bringing forward defense lawyers' views and fair trials guarantees in cooperation. And then Petra Vaart, Professor Petra Vaart, Central European University, a long-time friend of CEPS, with whom I've had the pleasure also to co-author many pieces dealing with the rule of law. So both of you are acting as discussants. I would like to ask you to really keep it to the agreed time, starting with you, Ilse.
Thank you. After those words, really no pressure, right? I will try to keep it to three main points. And of course, since I'm the representative of civil society on this panel, I have to address that. Our organization works with a network. We work in criminal justice, and we work with a network of partner organizations and lawyers. And so what we see that shrinking civil space and direct outright attacks on civil society are a widespread problem. It's not a problem of two countries, it's a much bigger problem. What we see is that our partner organizations are being criminalized, they are stricken from registers of associations, There are nuisance legal processes, some new legal requirements that need to be fulfilled. Ministers of Interior can start that process and lead to striking from the Register of Associations in as little as 2 months or a little bit more. What we see also are partner organizations that work, and lawyers. Michael mentioned legal education. A lot of, because of course, the field that we work in, a lot of our partners are lawyers who also go to people who are on the move, to asylum seekers, to go into detention facilities. They have faced disciplinary actions for that. They are, even people who work whose work is a part of the solidarity effort have been charged with charges such as espionage. So what we see is the abuse of criminal law powers, principle of legality, crimes that previously we would think have one definition are stretched beyond belief, to actually silence people who are inconvenient for the agenda, and part of it is tough on crime agenda, tough on migration agenda. And so that is what I feel compelled to address, because a lot of the time, yes, we are taking steps that are general and systemic, but still on the ground, it's not getting much better. And that leads me to a second point. We talk about about mutual trust. And mutual trust is a funny principle. It's sort of like a legal obligation at the moment. Trust in this context, in EU context, does not really at the moment have the same content as trust between people in relationships. So at the moment, what we see when we talk, and this is also part of our STREAM project, countries that have massive problems with rule of law, that have independence of judiciary problems of attacking civil society through legal means, are still very much part of mutual trust instruments. They are still part of mutual cooperation instruments. And national judges in member states are told to just trust and to uphold mutual recognition, uphold mutual trust, and they don't have access to safeguards, effective judicial protection. We still give people, surrender people under EAWs to countries that we know there are problems. And unfortunately, Court of Justice of European Union has not made it much easier to enforce actual on-the-ground safeguards, to ask for more information, to actually refuse surrenders in cases where there are these systemic problems. So the average Joe on the street does not benefit at the moment from these efforts to tackle rule of law in these countries. They are still part of the system and still very difficult, almost impossible, I'm not going to go into legal details, but to stop surrenders to countries with massive rule of problems in judiciary. And the third point, and I hope I'm sticking to my time, is that we have to also look internally at EU. We talk about policing NGOs. Seps has a brilliant report on that. We talk about surveillance on NGOs, but EU agencies and instruments can be used as a tool to reinforce that. We have a case at the moment that we work on where Europol has been used to exchange and store data on activists. So I think that we have to also think whether we need internal safeguards for situations like this, because whatever happens on a member state level, if there are spyware is abused, that data will be collected, that data will be exchanged. So we need to see whether we need additional safeguards to actually prevent also mechanisms that are well-intended, no doubt, but that can be abused to further erosions of rule of law, especially with regard to civil society. I will stop there because nobody's smiling.
your presentation, Ilse, actually highlights something we learned yesterday, how in some areas there is a lacking rule of law approach in the area of migration, asylum, or in terms of security, which falls within the scope of DG Home Affairs. There is a disconnect now, even structurally in the Commission, in terms of rule of law monitoring of what is going on in that DG. And these policy areas that some member states think they are exempted from rule of law obligations. Petra.
Thank you very much, indeed, Sergio, for the kind invitation and for being able to give my thoughts on the previous wonderful presentations. I will just tackle two topics, and the one is tools, the other is mutual trust, reflecting the title of this panel. So I very much agree with the previous discussant saying that this is not the issue of two or a small number of member states. Nevertheless, as a Hungarian, let me just state the obvious. We have member states in the European Union that are not liberal democracies. They are electoral democracies or even electoral autocracies. We have member states in the European Union that could not be admitted to the EU were they to apply today. How did we get here? I think it shows the lack of resilience of democracies on the one hand, and also it shows the lack of external forms of militant democracy, including EU instruments. The EU has been blamed often by scholars for not employing the full toolbox that it has available. Of course, one may argue that it came as a surprise what happened in various member states, taking a U-turn on the road to democracy. Many thought that the road to democracy was a one-way street. It's not. But then there was this other argument that the EU is lacking tools. I am one of those who argue that the EU is not and was not lacking tools. The tools were there already initially when backsliding started. They should have been used more creatively, more dissuasively, and in a coordinated fashion. So that shows the double nature of the EU's problem. On the one hand, we have state capture and lack of separation of powers, and on the other hand, we have inaction on the side of the European institutions, so a rule of law problem in the opposite direction. However, let me say something positive now. And there was a mushrooming of rule of law tools in the past, responding to the alleged problem that I just described. Some of these tools are not enforcement tools, like the annual rule of law report. I think they are very useful tools. They just should not be oversold as rule of law enforcement tools. But there is a rule of law enforcement tool that is new, and this is the conditionality regulation. I think it's a huge thing, and many of us wouldn't have dreamt of it 5 years ago when it was introduced. And finally, it has also been triggered. Now, of course, the big question is, can you really entrust the government that spent more than a decade on carefully dismantling the rule of law to return to it?
You tell us.
I leave it there. There is a second positive phenomenon, and that's also connected to the conditionality regulation. And this is the recent, February 2022 judgment from the Court of Justice of the European Union, making it unequivocally clear that the European Union has tools beyond Article 7 to protect values enshrined in Article 2. And perhaps, you tell me, this was the quasi-authorization that led the Commission, for the first time ever, as far as I know, to invoke Article 2 in an infringement case. It sounds like a nitty-gritty, a legal nitty-gritty, but it has overarching consequences for the future. How about mutual trust? I think mutual trust has been lost. That's a clear case. The question is, what do we do with it? We might do nothing, as it has already been said, that mutual trust, we pretend, we force member states from democratic countries, courts from democratic countries to cooperate with captured courts. That's one possibility. That's eventually what is happening. It's virtually impossible to suspend mutual trust-based and mutual recognition-based instruments. There is a very thin possibility offered by the Court of Justice of the European Union, but it's such a high threshold that it virtually never happens in real life. This is what our SAPS stream research shows. So we are forcing democratic states to cooperate with captured states. What will be the consequence? Of course, democratic states and democratic courts would be unwilling to become complicit in potential human rights violations. And here I would reflect to the interconnectedness of the rule of law and democracy that we often preach. What is lack of independence of the judiciary from a rule of law perspective is violation of fair trials rights from a human rights individual's perspective. So what will the democratic courts in democratic states do? They will just refuse to cooperate, overriding the primacy of EU law. If we don't have primacy, we don't have EU law. That's the end of the matter. Also, forcing these courts to cooperate with captured courts might force these courts to enter into a clash between their EU rights obligation and ECHR obligations. We are already seeing the Strasbourg court being nervous about some member states trusting too much other member states, which are not democracies. So what can we do about this? It has already been proposed. Perhaps give general solutions to generic problems and suspend mutual trust-based laws altogether until the rule of law is restored. Yesterday in a panel under Chatham House rules, someone said that would lead to impunity. I think this is a false argumentation. There is transfer of sentences, transfer of proceedings, mutual legal assistance. Non-surrender doesn't mean impunity necessarily. I think this is a mistake to think so. Looking at a forward-looking perspective, and this is my final word, how can we reestablish trust? We can have more human rights-oriented legislation. That is already happening in the EU, very much so, with regard to procedural guarantees. We could extend that to perhaps minimum prison conditions. And also, we could revive the idea of making the Charter of Fundamental Rights a union standard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Petra. Thank you so much, Petra, for your excellent presentation. I was wondering about this idea you mentioned about suspending mutual recognition instruments with states that clearly, there is no doubt that they are illiberal democracies, that they are autocracies, and that they cannot be trusted. I mean, I wondered about this idea, and also what you mentioned about what can we expect from, the monitoring tools when, the linkage with enforcement. Yeah, how does the monitoring serve enforcement purposes? But generally, I wonder, Commissioner Jourova, if you would like to respond to the comments or the previous presentations briefly, but also this element on suspending mutual trust, because indeed, lack of, what Petra mentioned, I wonder too, it doesn't mean impunity. Suspending the European arrest warrant, it sends a political message as well, very clear, that there is no trust with those countries and the national courts can, become about it and not put in the enormous difficulty to decide what to do at the expense of their trials.
No, I think that indeed the trust is heavily needed, and our European cooperation is based on it and counts with it. We have in our rules 100%, certainty or prediction that we can trust each other, which seems not to be the case. But at the same time, I would not like to demolish this architecture based on trust through and the mutual recognition instruments, which worked so well up to now, because of several cases where the trust is now decreased. And I remember cases when the non-surrender happened. It was, I think, it concerned Romanian prisons, and I think Hungarian case was there. You know it better than me, I don't remember well. But also the rejection of the recognition of the decisions of some Polish judges who were supposed not to be independent. So it is happening. I don't think that the judges in the EU are pushed to, in any case, sign the recognition. So maybe we are not maybe enough creative somewhere else than in the Commission. Because I have to react on what you said, that use the tool in a creative way is what the Commission should do. I cannot agree with that, because we also have to respect the rule of law principle, and the Commission has some competencies. And I had to say I had many dilemmas over the years when we were pushed to act and to launch infringement procedures and ask the court and, apply different sanctions. And I was always thinking, what is this call about? Should we really replace the constitutional tribunals in the member states? because very often it was the case for the Constitutional Tribunal in the country. And what do they want us to do? Isn't it the business for the voters in those countries to correct things? You know, this is how I understand the rule of law in the broadest possible sense. That's why maybe the new commission will be more creative. I hope not. Because for the sake of legal certainty, we should be really very precise. Sometimes, yeah, sorry, dry, legalistic. But we have to be predictable, because there must be other mechanisms functioning in the EU. Indeed, Mr. Orbán won the elections, and we had doubts whether the elections were free and fair. But still, we have to recognize him as the leader who won the still democratic elections. That's the reality. So this is my reaction on the last two speakers. For the NGOs, yes, I am aware that we didn't do much to protect the NGOs and the space for them. We are now reviewing the European Democracy Action Plan, where the chapter on the civil society should be enriched. And I received a lot of really very useful inputs from the group of NGOs. It was sometimes in December. They gave it to me as a Christmas present. I'm still swallowing it. and we have to do more for them. On what Michael said, yes, spyware is a growing issue. And we are still now in the discussion in the Commission how to react on it, because the usage of spyware by the states, and you know the story, it's the national security matter. So Commission do not push the nose into it. So we are pushing the nose into it from the angle of the fundamental rights. And I have to say I am really pushing the member states to correct the laws, which should do two things: to clarify where the limits for the states are, because the states can use the spyware to in the cases which are necessary, in the way which is proportionate. The people who are spied or listened to by the state should be informed afterwards. This is what they promised to me in Greece, for instance. But this is not the end of the story, and I think that we will have to reflect more this case in our rule of law report this year. The usage of spyware by private persons, private entities, no way. The GDPR is prohibiting it fully. Yes, so I think that there should be also some better understanding of this at the member state level. Madam the Czechs have not established the human rights institution yet. Who am I to breed the wine? No, the water, as a Czech. I have to speak to them. Madam O'Reilly, yes, this is always interesting to listen to you, because there is always a space to improve things, and now with the Qatar Gate and the case we have now in the Commission, the travels of the high senior paid by Qatar state. I was ashamed yesterday when I read it. I have to be open, because if the rules enable it, there should be some blockage for the concrete person. Yeah, I think that now we are discussing the ethics body, and what I hear, amazing things. Without the ethics body, we will still see the people running to different places with the briefcases full of money. My God, this is not for the ethics body. This is for Olaf and EPPO and the national prosecutors to do the job. I hear that the ethics body should be a monster dealing with the individual cases appearing in the institutions with investigative powers. If we have money for that now, I have doubts. But anyway, we should be much better in enforcing the rules inside the institutions. And you are right that unless there are financial penalties and some harsh consequences for the people, breaching the rules, then we will not be successful. Yeah. So we all have to do something inside our institutions, and I promise we will look into that in the Commission. But what really shocks me, that's I hear that without the ethics body there will be no ethics in the EU institutions. I am offended by that. There must be some moral compass, no? Some imperative which authorizes us to work for the EU. And if it is not the case, then yes, the mechanisms have to work. But I put here the pushback means, yeah. Yes, already now I hear the pushbacks against the ethics body, against the anti-corruption package, against the defense of democracy. I always look at which places are starting this pushback, and then I understand better whether we are doing the right thing or not. I believe we do, but we have to do better, and it's a shame when these cases are revealed. And what else to say? There are other things I wanted to... list of trialogues, I take it, yeah. That there was even... we have to reopen the discussion between Parliament, Council and the Commission on the Transparency Register, because the current one doesn't help on the cases like Qatargate, yeah. Because we are not registering the state actors there, or the actors paid by the states. So there are loopholes which we have to try to fill in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any immediate reaction by the panel? Very briefly, please, Michael.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, I just wondered this really interesting idea of suspending mutual recognition. I haven't confronted it in these terms before, so I'm thinking about it afresh, but I'm very hesitant. Remember, mutual recognition is reciprocal. So if you block the other side, you get blocked yourself, and we have to be careful what we're losing. It's also very context specific. I don't think it's good to deem a state in all of its complexity to be a pariah. States are way more complex than that, and so the determination of whether a transfer, let's say, of a prisoner is correct or not, very much is an issue of context. I think the focus should be on data, generating the evidence so that individual judges in, let's say, the European arrest warrant can make the right decision. We maintain a database on detention conditions, for instance, but there's way more involved than that. But it's about generating the evidence so the judge can make the appropriate choice in the given moment. I also think, last word on mutual recognition, I don't think its suspension is going to frighten people to death. I don't see it as the game changer to change the sort of despotic regimes that you're describing. And that's it, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Before, immediate, Emily? Sorry, Ilse.
So, yeah, just very briefly, my suggestion was not more to suspend mutual trust instruments, but actually make them earn mutual trust, to actually have an effective judicial protection. The judges go through the situation, through the case, and actually have the power to refuse surrender. But now we have very few surrender grounds, very strictly interpreted, and in the best case, when there's doubts, we have to ask for diplomatic assurances that nobody follows up, as a sort of, you know, security and safety mechanism for upholding human rights in those situations. So what I would suggest, I don't know, I guess that involves a very complex and nearly impossible revision of EAW, but something that needs to be done. It's been more than 20 years, and we have a charter. We need to update it. But actually, my idea is more towards, let's give national judges the power to actually do something about it, to have a meaningful review in each case and have a ground to say no.
Petra, would you like to develop on this? Because, of course, you put it forward, and also as a project, we are exploring this option, so please.
Absolutely. So the aim is not to deter member states from sliding down the scale. And this is a response to you, Michael. The idea is to prevent human rights violations. Of course, there are, when we oblige judges according to the test developed by the Court of Justice to engage in a dialogue about the human rights, rule of law situation in the country, it makes sense with regard to prison conditions. And indeed, you made reference to these prison conditions cases, because two judges can discuss whether the person who is surrendered would be placed in a decent prison or not. Of course, Fair Trials has wonderful research on it. What happens with these people after they have been surrendered? They have been put in these wonderful prisons, and 3 months later they've been transferred to the awful prisons. But that's that's just in brackets. But what doesn't make sense to my mind is to make judges in democratic countries ask their counterparts in non-democratic countries the following question: are you independent? What should the other judge respond to this? Right? So, and what is very important to me is that if the system doesn't work, then the individual judge might be a hero. He might be a Superman, a Batman, but that's not the idea of the rule of law, that a judge goes against his or her own legal system and very courageously passes judgments that are in line with the rule of law, or dares to ask a question in the form of a preliminary reference from the Court of Justice, knowing that she might be subjected to a disciplinary proceeding. That's not the rule of law. The idea is not to have judges as superheroes. The idea is to have procedures and institutions that are correct. That's what the rule of law is about. So a systemic problem leads to, I think, systemic responses. And as to the final issue, I just didn't propagate anything illegal when I said creative, okay? I think one can dream big. You did it with regard to connecting money to values, and it came true. So this is more what I praise the Commission for. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra. Emily, would you like to contribute?
Thank you. I just in relation to financial penalties, I don't want anybody to think that I am advocating financial penalties or prescribing whatever penalties might be applied to people who break the rules. What I was talking about, I was picking up on what you said had incentivized certain countries to behave themselves in relation to the rule of law, finance. So I was looking at what incentivizes, what other incentivation methods might work, and then just reference what happened after the scandal. But that was that certainly incentivized people to fill out the forms and so on. But we're talking about judges, and I was just something that Michael said, and which is something that I've been thinking about, but it's sort of something that's in the ether rather than I see as concretized, certainly not in my mind anyway, or my understanding of it. But Michael, you mentioned the fact that the ECJ rulings not being implemented. And when I talk about my work, because I don't make binding decisions, I tend to make this easy black and white distinction between an ombudsman. I don't make binding decisions. I'm not a judge. I don't just bang the gavel on the table and it has to be done. And then over the last few years, I've been thinking, well, the ECJ is that sort of court with binding decision-making powers, but are some rulings just disappearing, not being implemented? We see it in our own work to a certain extent with access to documents when a case is brought to the court and the ECJ absolutely upholds the purest reading of the value of transparency in the treaties and people's right to involve themselves in the democratic life of the treaty, and the default position should always be released. And then you find that actually documents, even after certain court rulings, are still not being released for some reason. So, I mean, I'm not the moderator here, but I'd really like to hear Michael's talking a little bit more. And I think you can have a coffee on that, because it is bothersome when we talk about the state of the courts in the member states, and then we hear that on occasions the rulings by the ECJ are not being implemented. That's a little bit disturbing.
Michael.
I regret ever saying it. I think it is actually a very topical issue to look at the implementation of judgments and how the political machinery of the EU can be better engaged in that work. It doesn't work very well in the Council of Europe, but at least there's a machinery there, a very clear, explicit machinery whereby the political Council of Europe has to engage the non-implementation of judgments and impose whatever pressure. So I don't really want to say any more about it than that at this stage, Emily. But it's I raised it, but I raised it for discussion and reflection, because I think maybe it would benefit from being the target of some focused reflection, something the agency indeed could do, but much more widely than that.
And in fact, this also corresponds to yesterday's conversation. Also, national judgments. What about enforcement and implementation of national judgments in this country? As Belgium may be one example of that. Now, we have limited time, for a panel, but I will pick up a couple of questions, only a couple of questions, I'm afraid we have time. So be very concrete, introduce yourself, and really a question, no comments. We have no time for comments, just question, please. And to whom? Please.
Piotr Bogdanowicz, professor at the Warsaw University, Poland. I have the question to Commissioner Jourova. You said that first, this is the rule of law issues are topics for the Constitutional Tribunal. What if the Constitutional Tribunal in given country is not impartial? Of course, you can start infringement proceedings as you did against Poland, but still, we don't have this option. Then the second option, even more important, I think, you said that this is the business for voters. And I agree with that. But what if voters are biased? What if, as a consequence of propaganda in public television, for instance, lack of independence of regulators, as it takes place in Poland, basically these voters have a view which is far from reality. And again, you can start infringement proceedings as you did, for instance, against Hungary for Klub Radio. But this is like a very specific infringement proceedings. And the question is whether we don't need a more coordination at the level of European Commission, because, for instance, this media pluralism is captured by you, but also it is captured by Commissioner Breton. And I'm a little bit afraid that we look at this issue too much from the perspective of internal market and not from the perspective of media pluralism as a part of rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent questions.
First on the second one. Indeed, we have no other choice because we don't have a chance to find another legal basis than the internal market. I'm not happy about that. But with the Media Freedom Act, I tried to correct or increase our ability to act. Because Klub Radio, we had to reach for the telecommunication rules. Other breaches, we had to act, but it was never the thing to be done. To say these are media which need to be protected. So now this law has a lot of influential enemies, but I hope we will have the Media Freedom Act done still in this mandate. On the Constitutional Court, when it is not functioning or when it is not independent, for the lack of time, I didn't mention it. but of course, I said that in some cases we are pushed to replace the constitutional tribunals, and indeed, this is now a bizarre situation when President Duda is waiting for the judgment of the Constitutional Court, which we do not recognize as independent. But I have to repeat, well, we wait for the signature of the head of state, because this is for us the key moment. While, of course, referring the Polish Constitutional Tribunal to the European Court of Justice, which we did, I think, last week. And the second thing, in emergency regime, remember in Hungary, it was far-reaching regime. We were asked to launch infringement, and I said, I don't have any chance to do that, because this is for the Constitutional Court in the country. And of course, I was ridiculed that, yes, what are you speaking about? Which court in Hungary? But we have to respect the stay of play and not to overcome or overshoot our actions, I'm afraid. And the voters, yes. Is there an opposition in the country? Is the opposition doing something? It's not my job to win the elections for Mr. Tusk, for instance. Yeah, sorry, but I wanted to be illustrative.
There was somebody else? Please, Camino. I will take two more questions, please. First, Camino.
Thanks. Commissioner Jourova, very quick question. You mentioned Spain. Do you think if Spain does not carry on with the changes that the Commission is asking it to be, the recovery fund can be in danger? Thanks.
Thank you, Camino. Let's pick up another question and we come back to the panel. Please. You too.
Adam Koesh, and I would like to ask my question in a private capacity. So how do you measure rule of law in countries where, how do you account for the differences where in a country the violation of rule of law and corruption is systemic, and in other countries where it's an anomaly? I mean, in my private opinion, I think there should be a categorical difference between the two.
Last question. I'm afraid we need to close it, please.
Thank you. Eric Maurice from the Fondation Robert Schuman. About the conditionality, you said people understand money, but conditionality is very specific and it could not be triggered in the case of Poland. And in the case of Poland, there will not be like new recovery plans in which we could ask for reforms. So mentioning conditionality, which is very specific, where does it leave the usual tools like infringement, which did not make this country change their laws, and Article 7? How do you see the balance between all these tools in the future? Thank you.
Colleagues, I don't want to grab it, but the question seemed to be directed to me. Spain, in case Spain will not correct the situation of the National Council, we will repeat the recommendations in July, and the Spanish authorities know it well. Of course, there are elections coming, regional now, and then in November the parliamentary elections, so we have to bear into account the fragile moments, but I am pushing both sides, both the government and the opposition, sit together and do two things: unblock the situation now, install the judges, and change the system for the National Council. So we are waiting now for the reaction of Spain, and of course it's a highly sensitive topic in Spain now. How to measure the rule of law when there are systemic breaches, which we recognized for Poland and Hungary? It has to be for the Article 7 procedure. When there are breaches which can be cured by infringements, we are going this way. But in any case, we now have the method of using the combination of tools, strengthening the effect. Yes, so conditionality in combination with Article 7 plus infringements, plus the push on implementation of the infringements. Don't forget, Poland now pays €1 million per day for having the problems in judiciary.
Thank you. Final statement, Michael, Emily, one final statement you would like to share before closing. That's your last option, please. Very short.
Yeah, I'm going to actually, it's from the comment down there about how you can treat an egregious country with one that's just having almost day-to-day problems. What's really important is that we treat all 27 equally in terms of the mechanism and the methodology. The outcomes will be very different, but we have got to recognize not only that we have problems everywhere, but that we have to be seen to treat each country by the same standard.
Yeah, I'm just going to repeat what I said earlier, that it's very important that we have the highest possible standards within the EU administration, and I welcome what Madame Jourova said in relation to that case yesterday that emerged and her reaction to it, which is very honest, and I think once that is understood just how bad those cases are for the image of the EU and for the trust of the citizens, I think it's important that recognition is there. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that we just, from perspective of my work, I think that we need to pay a lot more attention to real life consequences of breaches of rule of law. And while I think systemic work is very important and it needs to continue, we need to also see whether that has a very tangible and real effect on the ground. And I think we need to pay extra attention to that. Thank you.
I'm the one who is saying controversial things today, so I'm not sure whether equal treatment will work. Think about autocracy, the difference between autocracies and democracies. How about financing your media authority? Well, this is a virtue, isn't it? But if your media authority is just a propaganda institution, then financing it will not be necessarily a virtue. So I think the EU sooner than later will have to face the problem of how to methodologically deal with this systemic problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This all makes me think of the concept of merited trust instead of mutual trust that Balsamas Miselegas in his work has also put forward. You know, the conditions under which we can trust. Trust is not a given, it's a daily practice. This is something I've learned since day one in my work at CEPS. Merited trust, deserved trust, instead of mutual trust. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for your questions, and enjoy the day. Great continuation. Yeah.